In a quiet corner of Pennsylvania, Bell's Tavern is known not just for its history, but for its haunted past. The story centers around Mary, a young woman with a tragic fate. She was allegedly murdered by her jealous husband in the tavern, her life ending in anger and sorrow. But Mary didn't leave the tavern after death. To this day, her spirit is said to roam its darkened halls. Guests and staff have reported sightings of a woman in old-fashioned attire, her face expressionless yet intense, her eyes staring with a knowing gaze. Legend has it, Mary's ghost appears only before tragedy strikes, as though warning the living of impending misfortune. Those who see her or hear her whispers often suffer nightmares filled with dread, and hear unexplainable sounds at night, faint footsteps, muffled sobs, or the chilling rustle of skirts sweeping across the floor. Her eerie presence has made Bell's Tavern a place to avoid after dark, yet it continues to attract those curious or brave enough to face Mary's ghostly apparition. The air inside Bell's Tavern always felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on the chest. Some said it was the old, damp wood, but others whispered that it was Mary's lingering sorrow, filling every corner and darkened hallway. One night, a visitor named Jacob, new to the area and skeptical of ghostly tales, decided to stay at the tavern despite the warnings from the locals. He chuckled at their tales, brushing them off as superstitions. But as he settled into his room, the laughter faded. The room felt colder than the rest of the tavern, and the small window rattled despite the stillness outside. Around midnight, Jacob was jolted awake by the faintest sound. Started low, like a distant whisper. At first, he thought it might be a trick of his mind or perhaps a draft in the walls, but the sound grew clearer. A soft humming, sorrowful yet melodic, seeped through the silence. Goosebumps prickled his skin as he sat up, trying to place the sound. It was coming from just outside his door. Curiosity and a tinge of fear pushed him to his feet. He moved slowly, each step creaking as he made his way toward the door. He held his breath, listening intently. The humming stopped. With a shaky hand, Jacob opened the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the faint glow from an old lantern flickered near the stairs. Just as he was about to step back, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure at the end of the hallway. A woman stood there, barely visible in the low light, her long dress brushing the floor. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but her eyes seemed to look directly at him, as though piercing through to his very soul. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he was staring at Mary. Her face was as pale as the moonlight, her eyes hollow, yet filled with an unspoken message. Frozen in place, Jacob could only watch as she lifted her hand, pointing down the hallway toward his room. Before he could even process what was happening, a sharp crash echoed from inside his room. He spun around, heart racing, and rushed back inside, flicking on the light. The small mirror above the dresser had shattered, shards scattered across the floor, glinting in the dim light, and scrawled across the cracked glass were the words, "Leave now or you'll be next." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the ominous words written on the fractured mirror. The message, written in what looked like a faint red smear, made his stomach twist with dread. He glanced back at the hallway, but Mary was gone. The air felt colder, heavier, and an intense silence filled the room. He forced himself to breathe, to think logically, though his every instinct screamed at him to leave. Still, his curiosity fought back against his fear. Was this some elaborate prank? Perhaps the townsfolk were testing the gullible outsider who'd scoffed at their ghost stories. Determined to find some explanation, he grabbed his phone to photograph the mirror, but the screen remained dark. No power. He cursed under his breath, checking the battery. It had been fully charged when he'd arrived. Suddenly, the humming returned, faint and mournful, filling the room like a haunting lullaby. This time, it was closer, more intense, as though Mary herself stood just out of sight, waiting. The sound grew louder, filling his ears and drowning out all other thoughts, until it stopped abruptly. Silence settled again, thick and unnerving. Just then, a gentle knock came from the door. The sound was soft but deliberate, each tap sending a jolt through his body. He swallowed hard, then called out, "Who's there?" His voice sounded weak, even to his own ears. The knocking continued, slow and unhurried, as though whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world. With a shuddering breath, Jacob approached the door and swung it open, half expecting to see Mary's ghostly figure staring back at him. But the hallway was empty. Relieved but still on edge, he took a step outside, peering into the darkness. The lantern at the end of the corridor flickered, casting long, sinister shadows across the walls. His gaze drifted downward and his heart skipped a beat. Fresh, wet footprints dotted the floor, leading down the hall toward the stairs. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, Jacob followed the trail, his steps mirroring the faint outlines of bare feet on the dusty wooden floor. As he reached the staircase, he noticed the footprints veered off to a door he hadn't noticed before, a small, unmarked door at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it, darkness swallowed all light. An unnatural, earthy smell wafted from within, reminding him of damp soil and decaying wood. He hesitated, every fiber of his being urging him to turn back. But something, perhaps a morbid curiosity or a sense that he was being watched, pushed him to step forward. He reached out and nudged the door open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the tavern's basement. The air grew colder, more oppressive, as he descended the stairs, each step creaking underfoot. Shadows clung to the walls, and his flashlight barely cut through the darkness. As he reached the bottom, he found himself in a dimly lit room with shelves of dusty bottles and faded boxes. In the center of the room was an old, rotting wooden table, and sitting on it was a small object, glinting faintly in the dim light. He stepped closer, squinting to make out what it was. A locket. He picked it up, noticing the initials engraved on its surface, MB. His hands trembled as he realized it belonged to Mary. He pried it open with shaky fingers, revealing a faded portrait inside. A young woman with sad eyes looked back at him, her face hauntingly familiar from the ghostly figure he'd seen. Before he could react, he felt a chill against his neck, like a cold breath brushing against his skin. He froze, his heart pounding, as he heard the unmistakable whisper of a woman's voice right beside his ear. "Why didn't you listen?" He whipped around, but no one was there. The basement was empty, silent once more. But as he turned back to the table, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a handwritten note, yellowed with age, lying beneath the locket. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Jacob stared at the note, his fingers trembling as he reached for it. The paper was brittle, its edges frayed, as though it had been hidden away for years, untouched by human hands. Unfolding it carefully, he squinted to make out the faded ink. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, as if the author had written it in a moment of desperate haste. "To whoever finds this, beware. She cannot be freed. She is bound by blood and betrayal, and she comes to those who ignore her warnings. I write this as my last act before leaving this cursed place forever. Mary will not rest. She seeks justice, and she will not be stopped." As Jacob read, a chill spread through his body. The note seemed to have been written by someone who knew Mary's ghost well, someone who had witnessed her vengeful appearances and barely escaped. Before he could process the words further, he heard footsteps above him. Slow, steady, deliberate. It was as if someone or something was moving through the tavern, heading directly for the basement stairs. Panic seized him. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape in the tight, enclosed space of the basement. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the wooden staircase, each step a hollow thud that made his heart race faster. He backed up, pressing himself against the cold stone wall, clutching the locket and the note. Just as he considered bolting for the stairs, the footsteps stopped. Silence hung thick in the air, amplifying his shallow breaths. He waited, barely daring to breathe, listening for any hint of movement. The silence stretched on until the light flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows around him. In the corner of his eye, he caught a movement, a shape forming in the far corner of the basement, just beyond the reach of the weak light. It was her. Mary. Her figure slowly materialized, as if rising from the very shadows themselves. Her gaze was locked on him, her eyes filled with a haunting sorrow and an anger that felt ancient, unyielding. Jacob was paralyzed, unable to look away. She reached out one hand, her translucent fingers pointing at him with an air of accusation. The room grew colder, her presence filling it with a suffocating weight. "You should not have come," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind as much as in his ears. "You have awoken what should remain buried." His mouth went dry. I didn't mean to," he stammered, barely able to speak. "I just wanted to understand." She stepped closer, her figure flickering like a broken image, becoming clearer and more terrifying with each step. The anguish on her face shifted to something darker, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "They all wanted to understand," she murmured. "But they did not listen. They did not heed the warnings. And now they pay." Jacob tried to take a step back, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Desperately, he held out the locket, his hand shaking. Is this what you want?" Mary's gaze softened for a moment, her eyes flickering to the locket. The anger faded, replaced by a deep, immeasurable sadness. She reached out as if to take it, her fingers brushing against his hand, sending an icy shiver through him. But just as quickly, her face twisted back into a mask of fury. "Justice cannot be given so easily," she hissed. "Not while betrayal stains this place." Without warning, the basement door slammed shut, and the light went out completely, plunging Jacob into utter darkness. He fumbled for his phone, but it remained dead, its screen refusing to come to life. The only sound was his own breathing, quick and shallow, and the faint rustle of movement in the pitch-black room. And then, just inches from his face, he heard her voice one last time, a whisper that chilled him to the bone. "You belong to Bell's Tavern now." Jacob's pulse thundered as Mary's chilling words echoed in the darkness around him. "You belong to Bell's Tavern now." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. The walls seemed to close in, the damp air pressing against him like a heavy shroud. He edged backward, inching his way along the wall, his only thought to escape. But as he took a step, his foot collided with something solid. He knelt down, feeling in the dark, and his fingers closed around a rusted iron handle. He recognized it instantly, an old, trapdoor-like hatch he hadn't noticed before, partially hidden beneath layers of dust and cobwebs. Desperation overtook him. He pried the hatch open, wincing as it let out a shrill, rusty creak, and peered down into the depths below. A narrow, uneven set of stone steps led into an even darker, more claustrophobic space beneath the basement. He hesitated, but a strange pull, perhaps the same morbid curiosity that had kept him there so long, urged him downward. He took the first step, then another, descending into the unknown, his hand trailing along the cold stone wall for support. The air grew heavier, mustier, carrying a smell of damp earth and decay. Shadows shifted around him as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and a dim, eerie glow appeared ahead, a sickly greenish light coming from deeper within the tunnel. He crept forward, rounding a corner, and found himself in a small, hidden chamber. In the center was a rough stone altar, upon which lay an assortment of strange, unrecognizable items. Old, rusted tools, broken pieces of jewelry, and a collection of yellowed, crumbling papers. But what caught his eye was a bundle lying at the very center of the altar, a bundle wrapped in rotting, ancient cloth. As he stepped closer, he saw that the cloth was embroidered with the same initials he'd seen on the locket, M.B. His heart sank as he realized what this might mean. This was Mary's final resting place, hidden away, forgotten, or perhaps intentionally concealed. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of the cloth. A cold gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the greenish light and leaving him in absolute darkness once more. And then he felt a hand on his shoulder, icy and firm, holding him in place. Mary's voice, soft and menacing, echoed in the silence. "Now you know the truth, but you can never leave." Panic flooded Jacob's mind as he tried to wrench himself free from her grasp, but the hand held fast, like iron. Images began to flash before his eyes, moments from Mary's life and her death. He saw her smiling at a man, felt her love and trust, felt the abrupt terror as betrayal shattered her world. He felt the icy blade of jealousy, the anger, the suffocating pain as her life drained away. And then he saw her, his own reflection in her tear-filled eyes, as though she were looking at him, pleading, through time itself. With a surge of defiance, he pulled himself free from her grip, staggering backward. He grabbed the locket, clutching it tightly, his voice trembling but resolute. I know what happened to you, and I swear, I'll make it right, he gasped. Just let me go. For a moment, silence filled the chamber. He felt her presence waver, like a fading shadow. Then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. Find the truth, or join me forever. The grip on his shoulder loosened, and he stumbled backward, his body shaking as he gasped for air. The eerie green light flickered back to life, casting faint shadows around him. The room was empty, the altar bare. No trace of the locket, the bundle, or Mary's presence remained, just an oppressive silence, lingering in the damp air. The tunnel stretched before him, dark and foreboding, leading him back toward the world above, if he dared to face it. Jacob stumbled back up the uneven stone steps, his mind racing, heart pounding. The images he'd seen, the betrayal, the anguish in Mary's eyes clung to him, like ghosts refusing to let go. As he reached the basement, he found the door to the main floor slightly ajar, though he had left it shut. The faint, dying light from the tavern's lanterns beckoned him, a small hint of warmth in the chilling emptiness around him. Steeling himself, he made his way up to the main floor, breathing a shaky sigh of relief as the familiar, dusty surroundings came into view. He headed for the front door, eager to escape into the night, to leave Bell's Tavern and its haunted walls behind him. But as he approached the exit, he noticed something strange. The photographs lining the walls, old portraits of guests and past owners, had changed. In each photograph, the people's expressions had turned to ones of horror, eyes wide and mouths frozen in silent screams. His own reflection appeared in the glass of the nearest frame, looking pale and haunted, his eyes shadowed, just like those of the people on the walls. Desperate to escape, he grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, yanking with all his strength, but it was as if the door was locked by an unseen force. Panicking, he ran to the nearest window only to find it too sealed tight. The entire tavern seemed to pulse with an energy that kept him trapped, as though it had absorbed him into its walls, its very being. In that moment, he remembered Mary's final words, "Find the truth, or join me forever." His gaze swept around the room, landing on a dusty ledger behind the bar, thick with age. Taking it in his trembling hands, he flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the old, faded ink until he found it a record from the night of Mary's death. Details he hadn't heard from the locals emerged in haunting clarity. Mary's husband had not acted alone. The owner of the tavern, along with other townsfolk, had helped cover up the murder, sealing her remains beneath the basement. Out of greed and jealousy, they'd buried the evidence, allowing her spirit to fester in this forgotten tomb. It wasn't just betrayal by her husband, it was a conspiracy, the entire town turning against her to keep their secrets hidden. As he read the final, damning details, the room filled with a low, rumbling sound, like a sigh of long-held relief. He looked up to see Mary's ghostly form materialize before him, softer now, her anger dimmed but still watchful, her gaze fixed on him with a quiet intensity. "You found the truth," she murmured, a faint smile ghosting across her lips. The sorrow in her eyes seemed to lift, if only for a moment. "You've done what they would not." The room grew warmer, the oppressive chill fading. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing the cool night air beyond. Mary's form began to fade, her features softening, becoming almost peaceful as she looked at him one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice like a breeze, barely audible. "I am free." With that, She vanished, her presence dissolving into the night. Jacob stood alone in the empty tavern, a profound silence filling the space where her spirit had lingered for so long. He took one last look around, feeling the weight lift, the darkness fading from the corners of the room. As he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp night air, he turned back to see the old tavern standing solemn and still, its windows dark, its secrets finally laid to rest. He knew he would never return to Bell's Tavern. But as he walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace, a silent gratitude from the spirit he had helped release. And though he would always remember the haunting gaze of Mary's ghost, he knew she was finally at rest, and that he had escaped, spared from becoming another soul trapped within those cursed walls. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.